Welcome to the Arenas podcast, the analysis of and responses to extremist narratives, where we explore the depths of extremist narratives across Europe. I'm your host, Firdaus Alawi, and today we are exploring how Finland's history has shaped its far-right ideology, especially when it comes to ideas around science.
The Republic of Finland is a country of 5.6 million inhabitants in the north of Europe. After a long Swedish rule, the Grand Duchy of Finland was established in 1809 as an autonomous state ruled by the Russian Empire. This period saw the rise of the Fennoman nationalist movement, while it was the first European state to grant universal suffrage, which it did in 1906. Following the October Revolution in Russia, Finland declared full independence in 1917, leading to a civil war and the establishment of a constitution. During the interwar period, a Greater Finland ideology arose, and one stream of the nationalist group radicalized and formed the Lapua movement, a fascist pro-German anti-communist organization. They were banned after a failed coup d'etat in 1932, but their symbol, a man riding a bear, would resurface in right-wing organizations. First, in the Patriotic People's Movement, active until the Second World War, during which the Soviet Union launched the Winter War against Finland, but after 5 years, peace was restored. Throughout the Cold War, Finland was located in the grey zone between East and West. Though officially neutral, the Finno-Soviet Pact of Friendship, Cooperation and Mutual Assistance was signed in 1948. However, market economy was maintained. During the second part of the 20th century, Finland built one of the most extensive welfare states in the world based on the Nordic model of social security. In the post-Soviet era, more extreme forms of patriotism and nationalism appeared. After being a land of emigration until the 1980s, Finland received the first large group of immigrants following the war in Somalia in 1991. At the same time, the country entered an economic depression, leading up to the founding of the Finns Party in 1995. A party based on anti-establishment views and Christian values, with a message that they are the only ones able to save the country. A few years later, the ethno-nationalist organization Suomen Sisu was founded, copying the colors of the fascist Lapua movement and relying on historical references. They became a channel for the most extreme elements of far-right ideology in the Finns Party. In 2022, Finland's long-lasting military neutrality was questioned after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and a supermajority of both the country's citizens and politicians became in favor of NATO membership. Thus, Finland became the 31st NATO ally in April 2023. In the parliamentary elections the same year, the Finns Party became the country's second largest party with 20.1% of the votes, and they entered a coalition government with the National Coalition Party, the Christian Democrats, and the Swedish People's Party of Finland.
We are joined today by researcher Gwenaëlle Bauvois from the University of Helsinki. Hello, good morning.
Hello.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me.
It's such a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Before we start talking about Finland and the episode in itself, I do want to take a few moments to talk about you and your work. You are specialized in right-wing populism and far-right, conspiracies, counter-media, post-truth politics, among many other topics, right?
Correct.
Some of the projects that you have been doing, and I want to talk about a couple in the last few years, is post-truth politics, nationalism, and the delegitimization of European integration, and the vaccine fighters. So basically, like researching about the anti-vax movement in Swedish-speaking Finland.
Correct.
Can we talk a bit, or can you tell us a bit about your line of work, about your field? What is it exactly that you do?
Yeah, I think you mentioned many of the topics I've been researching. Of course, for many years I've been focusing on far right, especially in the Finnish context, but also the Swedish context, French and American context as well. And I've been focusing quite a lot on the anti-immigration narratives, and especially this kind of more extremist movement, anti-immigration movement in the Finnish context. But I've been also very interested in the media aspect and how these kind of groups are also communicating on their social media platforms, but also the influence of counter media outlets and how this kind of narrative and so-called fake news are being spread by this group and also by far-right politicians. So this is what I've been doing for the past 10 years, and it's been really interesting, and it's great to use all this expertise in the context of the Arenas project for sure. So I'm really excited for the upcoming years.
Definitely, definitely. I do want to ask you as well. I've asked other guests the same thing. How are you finding it at Arenas? What do you think about the project? Do you like it? Do you like focusing it on Finland? And I want to add another question, which is, does your research make it easier for you to identify, maybe this is very populist of you to say, or maybe this is a bit extremist for you to say? How do you find it?
It's been really great. I think it's a privilege to be involved in this project because, the topic is extremely interesting, very, very important, I think, especially in the context we are at the moment. And for me, it's amazing to be working with people from all over Europe. So I love the colleagues, and I'm able to work on several countries as well, because I'm focusing on Finland, but I'm also working on France because I'm myself French. So for me, it's been really great, and I'm really excited to see what will come up because we have so much to study still.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. Okay, then let's get into it. Let's talk about Finland. So
yes,
first,
let's do.
let's talk about the making of the nation, the creation of this national identity. So the concept of the Finnish nation has played a significant role in shaping the country's far-right ideology. So one of the intriguing aspects of the contemporary Finnish far-right is that some groups, for example, the Blue and Black movement, openly identify as fascist, which is quite unusual compared to other far-right organizations across Europe that use every single other term to describe themselves. But fascism, it's a big word to use, no? Can you walk us through some of the key historical moments and movements that have shaped this ideology? How do we end up that the Blue and Black movement openly identify as fascist?
Yes, so the Blue and Black movement was created in 2021 and registered as a party in 2022. And it was founded by members of the Finns party that were expelled for being too ethno-nationalist. And according to its current chairman, the party represents a new wave of fascism in Finland. And they consider the party as being part of the same tradition as the German National Socialist, the Italian Fascist, and the Spanish Franquist. So they do position themselves as being fascist. And of course, the Blue and Black movement, they build on a long history of Finnish nationalism. And the Finnish nationhood concept was created mainly by the Swedish-speaking intelligentsia, notably through the Phenomen movement in the 19th century that we can talk about it in more detail a little bit later. And of course, a very crucial historical event in the building of Finnish nationhood is, of course, the bitter civil war in 1918, fought between White Finland, the first government of independent Finland. They were under the Russian rule before, and the Red Finland, the Finnish Socialist Workers' Republic. And this civil war is very central motive for nationalist movement and far-right movement like the Blue and Black movement. And then during the 20s and 30s, like in many European contemporaries, at the time, one stream of the various nationalist groups radicalized in Finland, and this manifested through the Lapua movement in 1929, a radical nationalist, fascist, pro-German and anti-communist political movement. And the movement openly admired fascism and proclaimed to be protecting home, religion, fatherland. And the movement was banned after a failed coup d'etat attempt in 1932. And the Blue and Black movement is, of course, directly inspired by the fascist Lapua movement. as we can see in their name and the colors, they take the same color, the blue and black of the Bauvois movement. And to answer your question, how did we end up with the black and blue movement openly identifying as fascist? I would say that it's a good example of a contemporary far-right movement rooting directly its extremist narrative in history. And of course, it's some sort of a provocation to say openly, yes, we are fascist. Because for them, being fascist today is paying tribute to a glorious lost past. So they refer to the glorious past of Finland as a strong independent nation. But they obviously also adapt their ideology to the contemporary context. For instance, the blue and black movement is, of course, still very anti-communist, like the Bauvois movement was, but they also added very strong anti-immigration narratives that were not present originally, and they are also quite anti-gender, so to speak.
Yes.
So I think that they tried really to have this kind of shock value by saying, we are fascist. And it was like a way for them to identify themselves strongly and really connect to this glorious past that is very much idealized, of course, for them.
I see. It makes me think, when you talk about glorifying this past, because we see this like repetitively throughout the different European countries and like far right movements. Like, of course, it's like the past was a better time. We have to go back there. We have to bring it back and all that. But like, how does it differentiate between? I was thinking the Spanish case, for example. No, like we talk about the past, but it's kind of like far-right neo-fascism, even. Like, it's a new way of it. What is the difference between this and the black and blue movement? Like, how do they differentiate themselves with, like, this glorifying past? Because, like, it's the same aspect we have in other far-right movements, but, like, how is it different?
Yeah, but I'm not sure if, in essence, it's very different. Because their ideology is pretty much the same. And I would say, like, if you would define them, of course, you would define them as neo-fascist. You wouldn't define them as being fascist. But they position themselves as fascist because they want to maybe position themselves as being very genuine and like the true embodiment of the Finnish fascism. So I think it's just for them a purely rhetorical strategy.
Yeah, I see. Yeah.
And it's good to also remember that they are a very small party and they do not have much influence in the political landscape. Yeah. But they want to appear like they are like something really rooted in the past and that they are like the true heirs of that movement from the 30s. And so I think in their case, they are not that different from many other neo-fascist parties and movements you would find, for instance, in Italy. So that's the way they want to portray themselves.
Yeah. Well, we actually are going to talk about the similarities between the Finland's right wing and other European ones, but let's leave this towards the end of the episode. Now, I want to kind of take a different topic and talk about science, which is not talked about enough or much even, because like we usually focus on nation. We always talk about nation because it makes sense. It's the basic of everything. But it's interesting because we go from eugenics to the modern day selective use of science. The relationship between the far right and scientific discourse is quite complex and often contradictory. Earlier, you mentioned how the Fennoman movement in the 19th century engaged with eugenics, using it to justify the governance and control of certain populations. This legacy seems to have carried through the present day, with parties like the Finns Party employing scientific language and ideas to bluster this ideological positions. How could you say, or like, could you shed some light on how the far right in Finland navigates this tension between embracing and rejecting science, depending on whether like it aligns with their narratives or not?
So before we go into detail, of course, we have to understand that the politicization of science, it by no means a recent phenomena. So, of course, the polarization of political opinions on science-related issues has a long history also in Finland, as well as the use of scientific arguments to stigmatize parts of the population in the past and also today. So, of course, when we talk about science, it's worth mentioning eugenics in the context of Finland. And the phenomenon movement that I mentioned earlier in the 19th century already had some engagement in eugenics, and it influenced the discourses of governance of the Sami and Roma populations, who were commonly conceptualized as different culturally, socially, historically, and politically. And we can still feel, of course, the consequences of this narrative today. Obviously, there's still a lot of discrimination. And in the first half of the 20th century, eugenic ideology had some influence in Finland, but Finland was not a unique case. You could find that kind of phenomena in many parts of Europe. And in Finland, there had been some sterilization law, for instance, in 1935 and in 1950, especially of the mentally ill, and they were obviously rooted in eugenics. And of course, scientific reasons, often the spread of certain diseases, offered justification for the racial stigmatization and control of certain parts of the population, such as the Sami and Roma minorities. And this eugenic spirit ties with the narrative of Finland as a white country, excluding other Finns perceived as not being purely Finns, not being real Finns. So, of course, we see here as like the notion of nation and science are being intertwined. Obviously, there is this element when we talk about nation. And that's why, for instance, the Blue and Black movement, in their program for the EU election, the name of the program was A White Finland in a White Europe. So obviously, that goes back to this idea of Finland as a white country, excluding other Finns that might not fit this idea of a true Finn. And like in many other European countries, the relationship of far-right parties and science is quite complicated, as you mentioned in your question. It's always a bit difficult.
Yes, absolutely.
And the Finns party position, I would say, is not really anti-science per se. Although for scientists, it may often appear as anti-scientific in some ways. And according to researcher Tuija Saresmaa, a colleague of mine, there are like 3 ways of approaching science that are typical to the Finns party. First, the denial of certain research results if they don't really fit their ideology, the attempt to censor some scientific information, and also production of their own scientific content, for instance, through the party's own think tank called Suomen Perusta. So you have these 3 different approaches. And so that's why we could say that the Finnish far-right is not really anti-science, but the problem for them is that certain type of people are producing certain type of science. And the problem, for instance, for the Finnish far-right is that this science is produced by so-called ideological leftist intellectuals. And they represent for them a threat to the country, especially when they question traditional values and moral perceptions, in particular around the issues of gender, obviously. So here we can see, again, the overlap between science and gender this time.
Yes.
And the scientific rebuttals around gender have been probably the most visible over a longer period of time. So the idea that women are biologically different from men, that homosexuality is against nature, and these days even more that transsexuality is against the natural order of things. So of course, all this ideology around gender has been really central and very much criticized by the far right, of course. So, and the Finnish far right, as the far right in many other European countries, they usually reject scientific result when these results conflict with their own worldview. And of course, one of these worldviews is, of course, around the notion of climate change. That is also very, very central. And it's something that has been becoming more and more central in the past 15 years in Finland. So the discussions around environmental issues became a much stronger focal point in the Finns party ideology. For instance, climate change public debate have been described by former president of the party, Jussi Halla-aho, as climate hysteria in 2019, and by current president of the party, Riikka Purra, as climate fanaticism in 2021. So we can see there is a strong resistance against this kind of ideology that it's being pushed down people's throat, basically, about climate change. And what is also interesting in the context of Finland, it's not unique to Finland, but I would say it's pretty strong in this context, is that at the same time, the Finnish far right is criticizing the effort to save the environment, but at the same time, they're also glorifying nature with references to history. So this is something that is really strong in the context of Finland. And nature is understood in a romanticized and aestheticized sense. So for instance, forests and lakes are strong markers of a common national history and identity. So at the same time, they are like criticizing people defending nature, but at the same time, they glorify nature themselves. And it's something that can be seen quite strongly in the context of Finland. And of course, the Finnish far right, including politicians and supporters of the Finns party, they criticize especially research in social sciences and humanities. And they consider certain research areas as useless, basically. For instance, studies on racism, discrimination, gender, immigration, development studies. So they are really targeting this type of areas of research. And individual researchers, especially, of course, social scientists, have been targeted in Finland on social media by far-right politicians, activists, and supporters.
You have covered basically everything, because as you were talking, I was having questions and you were answering them directly. But I do have just one before we move to our next topic, because basically you've made everything very clear on like their approach to science, which is very interesting, because as you said, like it's not anti-science completely.
No.
Like we see it, for example, in the United States, that what we consider the very far right, like the very populist, is like, no, science doesn't matter. Science is not real. Like, you know, like it's abide just like by Christianity, but just by the Bible, which is not the case here. But in the case of climate change, that's what like interested me the most. We see, you said like there's this like duality between like glorifying nature and basically calling it a hysteria or like for the climate change movement. Now, but like then my question would be more: is there a denial in the far right movements in Finland of climate change? Is there some sector that is like, oh no, like this doesn't exist, or like does this hysteria just mean like these people are overly exaggerating climate change?
Yes, that's a good question. And I would say that there is not like a full-fledged denial. There might be some individual local politician or activist that might say things like that. But I would say that in the case of the Finns party, I think their line is that, yes, we do not deny that there might be some sort of climate change, but we are doing too much we are like being hysterical about it, and we need to calm down. We need to also let people live their life and not like becoming fanatic about that. So I think their position is more like that they are not going to say climate change is a hoax.
Yes.
But they might say like, yes, we don't deny that there might be things going on, but we have to be a little bit more reasonable about the way we react to this climate change. So it's a bit, they are like a bit on, in a gray zone in a way that they might not be openly like saying it's a total hoax. Yes. But at the same time, like, let's calm down and let people take plane and live their life and not, be too crazy about
I get
this.
you. I get you. Yeah. Well, it's it's again like this duality between like which position are you actually taking? Like, are you very much pro nature? Are you more like trying to? I feel like they're trying to like balance all of that. Yeah. So let's move on to our last topic, which we previously mentioned already, which is the fascist identity in Finland and the similarities in Europe. So while the Finnish far rights openly embrace the fascist label, this sets them apart from many of their European counterparts. There are still striking similarities in the ideologies and narratives employed by these groups across the continent. So despite the Finnish far-right's unique characteristics, such as, again, openness about their fascist identity, can you highlight some of the common threads that connect them to the European far-right partisan movement? What shared narratives, strategies, or ideological elements do we see emerging across this different national context? And how do they compare to the specific case of Finland that we've been discussing?
Yes, and I think in the context of the Arenas project, we have noticed that we could identify many common narratives between the countries that we are studying, and that is very fascinating. And it was so great to discuss with colleagues and see, okay, actually very different countries, but we can notice the same narrative being reused. And I would say around the nation, obviously, the references to a glorious past is very much present, and especially the history of wars. Wars is really an important element in order to historically construct othering categories. So I think it's something that we have noticed, that the glorification of the past, especially of wars, is really important, especially if they are connected to the independence of the nation. Of course, something that we have also noticed that we see in the Finnish far right, but in many other movements in Europe, is this idea of the degeneration of the nation, that somewhat there is some kind of collapse and we need to work to reestablish a society that is more connected to this glorious past, basically. And what we have also noticed, it's the reappropriation of national days. So, for instance, in Finland, the blue and black movement have been marching during the Independence Day. So, and you can notice similar reappropriation, for instance, in Poland. So it's something that we have noticed in several countries. And what was also quite interesting that when we've been discussing is that we can notice also some form of anti-communism that are more or less strong depending on the context, but it's something that can be still seen in Finland and of course strongly in other countries. So this was also quite interesting. And of course around gender, around science, of course the criticism of science, especially when the result contradict their vision, is of course something that can be noticed. And the attacks against social scientists, obviously, and again, what we just discussed about at the same time denying climate change but glorifying nature, obviously, and gender. When we talk about the movements like criticizing gender ideology, rainbow ideology, it's something that can be found in so many countries. So it's something that, of course, we can see in the Finns party, and especially also in the blue and black movement, but obviously in context of Spain, Italy, Poland, Serbia. This is very strong as well, and we see a lot of commonalities. And this idea that we need to defend traditional family value, traditional gender roles, can be seen with different degrees, but still very much so. And what is very, of course, interesting when we talk about these narratives in the European context, it is, of course, the fact that they are circulating, that it is not a static phenomena, that this narrative would stay in one specific national context, but they do circulate. And we can see that nationalist movements can also seek international outreach while defending their own nation. So that is an interesting phenomenon. So if we take, for instance, the movement of the soldiers of Odin that were created during the refugee crisis in 2015, it was created in Finland, but it spread in many countries in Europe and beyond. So they did seek that international outreach. And same with the Nordic resistance movement, it did spread also throughout the Nordic countries. So we can see that these extreme narratives do circulate transnationally, and they have a lot of similarities. And I think this is one of the main goal of the Arenas project, to also highlight the transnational aspect of the circulation of extremist narratives.
Absolutely. This connection, or like this interlink, if we want to put it like that, because I can't think of a better word, of the different countries, even though we see, and we have seen it throughout the episodes of this season, that the different countries, as much as they defend, like you said, their nation, and are very nationalist, and are very like closed, and it's just like us, they end up going like across their borders as well. So it doesn't matter how much they want to keep to themselves. It's always like very much, again, like interconnected. So it's very good to see like how like no one is saved, quote unquote, from this like globalization, even globalization of ideas, you know. So summarizing a bit everything that we have said, but specifically focusing on gender, because we haven't talked much about it, we go back to the same thing. It's what we said, like it's very clear their position on gender. It's one of the things that changes the least when it comes to far-right movements, not as well as science, as we have said, that it changes in different contexts. In some, it's more like absolute denial. In some, it's let's use it for our advantage, like we've seen, no? So yeah, this is going to lead us to a very much longer episode than the one that we have prepared for today. So let's stop here, if it's okay, no? Because I think we've already covered many of our bases. And yeah, I want to thank you, Gwenaëlle, again, for joining us today, because it was such a delightful conversation, and sharing your perspective with us. It was amazing hearing you talk, and as I said, honestly, I don't think one episode is enough. I think there should be a part 1 and part 2 to this topic. So yeah, thank you so much, and thank you, our listeners, for tuning in. We will see you in the next episode. Bye.
Bye-bye.
This podcast is part of the Arenas project, funded by the European Union Horizon Programme, under the Framework Programme for Research and Innovation, 2021 to 2027. Speaker voice, Gabriel Wahl.